I saw a post on social media the other day that got me started thinking about weddings, specifically the popular culture idea of weddings in the United States, as opposed to a lot of very real weddings that I've been involved in over the years. A young Facebook friend of mine started a new job recently, and apparently the company for which he works is in the wedding business. And he was writing a little bit about the musical selections that were being requested by the couple apparently who was getting married. And I must say those were musical selections that wouldn't have been my choice. Everybody's got their own thing, I guess. But I thought when he was writing this and posting it that, if he's in the wedding business, he's bound to see a lot of interesting things, a lot of very interesting things, because people behave in interesting ways when it comes to weddings, and there are just all kinds of idiosyncrasies that pop up with regard to weddings. So it may be a very interesting experience for him. This fellow is an exceptionally smart guy. Seems like a really good guy from what I can see from his social media posts, and I hope it's a great opportunity for him. But I started thinking about weddings and what I've seen in weddings over the years as opposed to what a lot of people expect in weddings. And there's this great big canon of literature concerning what is right and what is proper and what is expected with regard to weddings. But of course people have their own ideas about what they want to do, and weddings can be very idiosyncratic, I guess would be the word. There are a lot of people do things in their weddings that nobody else would even think of, and then some people choose to be very conventional. Then some people follow a lot of strict rules about who's expected to do what, how everybody's supposed to dress, getting new wardrobes for people, getting the invitations correctly done, having a very expensive cake, limousines, a very expensive fancily decorated hall, and the whole 9 yards. But people have very different ideas about weddings. What is a wedding exactly? Strictly speaking, a wedding involves the couple who are getting married, an officiant, somebody to officiate the wedding, and maybe a witness or two. And actually, in the strictest definition, that's what it takes to have a wedding. But in American popular culture, there are these deeply entrenched ideas about who pays for what, who gets invited, how they are invited, where the wedding's going to be, how the china is going to be set out for the reception, what's going to be served at the reception, who's going to dance with whom, how everybody's going to be dressed. There are just all kinds of ideas about what constitutes a proper wedding. And I have my own ideas about that. I came from a fairly working class background as opposed to middle class background. So nobody that I knew ever had the great white wedding that you see on TV and movies and portrayed in magazines and popular culture. That was just not something that anybody from my background did. And you grow up working class and you tend to keep a lot of those ideas with you no matter where you go, no matter what you do. And I certainly have. So nobody did the great white wedding. But I have been to a lot of interesting ones over the years. One of the more recent ones was one of my sisters was getting into, I think, her 3rd marriage, actually. And the people who attended this wedding were my future brother-in-law, sister, his son, and me. And what we did was we went to a small courthouse in a small town in another state where the marriage license was procured, and then we walk into this courtroom where this lady probate judge comes in to perform the wedding, and it's all over in about 10 minutes, and then we stop for burgers on the way back to our hometown. And that was very simple, not very many people involved. I thought it was fine. So that's one way that you can do it in a wedding. Another wedding, and I'll get to some that were a little bit more involved in a little bit, but another wedding was another sister of mine, and that was conducted in our parents' living room, very small living room, and it was just the person who was officiating there, the minister, and the couple, and the immediate household and that was it. It was over in like 10 minutes. Now, that was very simple. I thought that was fine as well. But I've attended some that have been more complicated, and a lot of times in TV and in movies, disasters are portrayed that happen at weddings, and just all kind of things can go wrong. The ex-boyfriend, ex-girlfriend comes crashing in, and the wedding's called off, and just all kind of disasters that can happen at weddings. And the more complicated the wedding is, the more likely it is that you're going to see some type of disaster. But I've seen some interesting things over the years. One of the bigger weddings that I attended was, well, first of all, let me say this. With regard to people who are of age, I don't think elopement is a proper term. There's no such thing as adult people eloping. If they want to get married, if they want to go somewhere and get married, they have every right to do that, and it should not be considered elopement or whatever it is that people call it. They have every right to do that. I have never known anybody who asked a parent's permission to marry, their daughter or anything like that. In my particular world, the people who decide they're going to get married make that decision completely on their own, and they don't ask anybody's permission. They just announce that they're going to do it, and then they do. And they usually make all of the arrangements themselves, whatever those arrangements are going to be. And I'm not a believer in having excessive control or involvement by families of either side, really, because the people who are getting married, it's their party. I mean, it's their marriage, it's their life. They have the right to make those decisions without a lot of interference, and that's just sort of the way it is in this working class mentality. Now, I know in wealthier families that the parents are actively involved in the husband and wife selection, and they'll apply pressure, and they'll threaten to cut off inheritances and all this thing, and they are very, very deeply involved in what happens. And they'll get really angry and cut people off if they don't marry someone who is approved of. The intense meddling that takes place in wealthy families is something that you just wouldn't believe unless you're familiar with it. But they do tend to exert, especially if they have a lot of money, a lot of control over their kids with regard to who they marry and who they don't. And I think that's ridiculous. I think it's completely up to the people themselves to decide who they want to marry. But two interesting things that I've seen at weddings over the years involve fire. Yeah, two fiery situations at weddings. And one of those was my second oldest sister. She got married in, I think, 1987 or so. The wedding took place at a community center, and I was asked to be an usher, and so I was escorting ladies down the aisle. And it was a nice room at a community center, fairly large, kind of set up like an auditorium with chairs on each side, and there's a center aisle, and there's a sort of an altar set up front. And the wedding march for that particular wedding was a song called "Nothing's Gonna Change My Love for You," and that was a song, with the vocal. It was a recording, but it was a song that was actually being sung on the radio a lot of the time. Nothing's going to change my love for you. And so the procession starts down the aisle, and right in the middle of the procession, as our dad and sister and the other people who were in the wedding, I forget who it was, but there were several people in the wedding. It was a little bit of a procession, and this one woman walks right down the center aisle, right in the middle of the procession, and takes her seat. And it's on the video. And I'm thinking, I'm not one for having all kinds of requirements about weddings and having all these niceties that have to be enforced and strictly observed and things like that. But there is such a thing as common sense. And to just, walk right down the aisle in the middle of the procession, that I thought was a violation of common sense. But this same person sort of got her comeuppance a little bit later, because I didn't see it when it happened, but I saw it later on the video where somebody says out loud, "Shirley, your hair's on fire." So this woman caught her hair on fire, and I'm thinking, how the hell do you do that? I mean, there's lots of candles around, things like that, but how did she catch her hair on fire at the wedding? That seems kind of strange. Anyway, it happened. There was no serious injuries or anything like that, nothing more than minor hair injury. And then in the middle of the ceremony being performed, the train comes through. And, you know, that was a little bit disruptive to have this train coming through. But all in all, it went off pretty well, and it wasn't expensive. It was cheap. I don't think I've ever been actually to an expensive wedding. And matter of fact, I think that was the only one that I've ever actually been to where there was a reception that involved dancing later. I think that's pretty common at a lot of receptions. But I've never seen more than a couple that way, and there was this time. So there was a situation with the train. There was a situation with this person just walking right down the aisle in the middle of the procession, and there was a situation with this person's hair catching on fire. So you do see a lot of strange things at weddings, and that was one. And then later on, I was asked to serve as an usher at a cousin's wedding. And this one, I think, was actually held in a church, a small church, and I was serving as an usher in this particular wedding, and everything went fine except up at the front of the church, part of the floral arrangement, and I don't know how it happened, but part of the floral arrangement actually caught on fire. So as the ceremony is going along, I'm up here fighting the fire, trying to put out the fire. And so that was an interesting thing that happened at a wedding. So I've seen two fiery situations at weddings. And then there was another one, actually my best friend's wedding, and that took place some years later. And the situation with that was my closest friend was getting married, and I had a close relationship with him and his wife and her daughter, who I was very close to, and she was becoming like a goddaughter or an adopted niece, and she's still that way till this very day. But I got a call on a Saturday morning. There was no invitation in the mail or anything like that, even though I knew it was coming, but they didn't go the invitation route. You don't necessarily have to, and they didn't. I knew it was coming, but I got a telephone call on Saturday morning, and it was Heather, I believe, and she said, "You want to come to a wedding tonight?" Sure, I'll be there. You know, I've got to be there. If anybody's got to be there, I've got to be there. Because my best friend William, you know, we had this kind of stepbrotherish relationship, stepbrotherish best friend relationship. We lived under the same roof, and that's happened several times over the years, us living under the same roof. And so I had a close relationship with him and his now stepdaughter in particular. So I dressed up in my gray suit. I just acquired a new charcoal gray suit, so that worked out pretty well, and it was right before Easter in 1996. And so I drive up there, and I suggested a March wedding, and they actually were doing this in March, and it was just bitter cold. And it was a small wedding. There was, well, actually I thought it was larger than it should have been, but they had it set up in this room in a church. It wasn't the main sanctuary or anything like that, and most of the people in this crowd were people that I wasn't really on speaking terms with for different sets of reasons. And I know you're thinking, you know, your people relationships are really complicated, and yeah, they are. They are kind of complicated, but it wasn't my fault. I can't help it if people want to be, well, never mind. But I've got some complicated people relationships. We didn't talk a lot to either his family or hers, except for his dad and his stepmom. I was on pretty decent speaking terms with them. So I go to this wedding, and I'm in this room full of people, most of which I'm not actually talking to, and yet it was I was the person who was kind of most required to be there, of all people, needed to be there. And so I was there, and William's brother, who hated my guts then, probably still does, I was actually spoken to by him for the first time in years. I think he was just trying to be civil or something like that, and so I didn't have a lot of people to talk to, and but I was sitting at the on the back row with the side of the room that Heather's family was on. Actually, it was on the left side of the row, and nobody was actually going to be in this wedding, so I didn't have anything to do. Especially, just my presence was requested and kind of required, and so I was there. And it wouldn't have been anywhere else on this occasion because of our long-standing relationship. But it was chairs set up, and there was this center aisle, and there was a bit of a pulpit and altar set up front. And all that happened was that William and Heather and her daughter just walked up the aisle, and then the clergyman did the ceremony. And the thing about this ceremony was that they were both extremely nervous, and I knew that. And they were going up there, and this guy who was performing the ceremony just seemed to went on, and I'm thinking, please get through this, because they're having a kind of a tough time up there. And all I could do was sit back on the back row, just kind of helplessly send my vibes of moral support that way and hope they got through the ceremony okay. And it turned out that they did. There were no problems. It sounded like there almost was a problem because their nerves were really getting to them really bad, but they did get through it okay. And so then the ceremony concludes, and everybody kind of surged forward, and so here I am, probably the key, most important person there. I'm just telling it like it was, and I'm having to wait for the crowd to kind of clear so I can get through and offer my congratulations. And so then we had a reception. I talked to William and then Heather and his dad and his stepmom, and there weren't a lot of other people there to talk to. But it was a fairly nice reception, and it was a sort of everybody just kind of pooled their resources and got it done, and it wasn't expensive at all. As a matter of fact, I heard the Hateful Brother say, I think this was more than he was expecting, actually. But it actually was a very nice ceremony. And it wasn't expensive. It was put on, and it didn't cost a lot of money, but it worked very well. But I will say this, I think that people who perform ceremonies really don't need to piddle around about it, because their nerves were getting to them pretty bad up there. Fortunately, there was no problem, but but I thought that was a nice ceremony, and I was happy to be there. So that was an interesting one that I was able to attend. And so I've seen a variety of wedding ceremonies in a variety of circumstances over the years. Most of them have been fairly cheaply done. How do I think they should be done? I think that wedding ceremonies should be left largely up to the couple, that it's their affair, that they should make all of the decisions, that both of them should be involved in it, that the groom shouldn't be locked out, that he should be very much involved in the decision-making process. But I've seen them, with dancing and music and without. William and Heather's ceremony, there was no music at all. It was just the three of them. They walked up there, and it turned out to be very nice, even though there was nobody actually in that wedding. Then there was the one where we drove to the courthouse and had burgers afterwards. I thought that was fine too. And then there was the one that happened in the living room, and that was okay too. So I've seen a lot of wedding ceremonies over the years, but none of them have been this great white wedding. And so I think as opposed to a lot of rules and regulations and customs and traditions, everybody has to do this, everybody has to do that, nobody can do this, nobody has to do that, invitations have to be done this way, rings have to be done this way, hall has to be set up this way, people have to wear this certain kind of specified clothing, and on and on and on. Instead of having a great big huge list, I think they can be done simply, and that's what I tend to favor. But I think there also is a matter of common sense. I mean, even as sort of lax and liberal as I am about those kind of things, if I had another wedding, it'd probably be on the beach somewhere, and I'm not having a formal wedding on the beach. I think that'd be ridiculous. And why would you have a formal wedding on the beach? On the beach, everybody just does beach wear or something like that. Even if it's a wedding, it wouldn't make it formal there. I certainly wouldn't. But I still think there's common sense. I still think you need to avoid things like walking down the aisle in the middle of a procession, if there's a procession. I think that people need to not set their hair on fire. And I think that people who officiate at weddings should consider that couple may be extremely nervous, and they should get through this before there's some kind of a problem, because sometimes there are problems at weddings. But I don't think it has to be all this complicated mess that a lot of people do. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with making money in the wedding business. There is that market, and it provides opportunities for people, and I think that's fine. But as far as being in weddings or participating in planning, I think they should be fairly simple. You can have a very nice ceremony, and it still be simple and inexpensive and yet memorable. And the funny thing is, some of these expensive weddings, the marriages crash and burn. You know, so you start to wonder what's the point of having a huge ceremony if that's going to happen, because about 50% of them do crash. Now, I'll tell you about the one that you're maybe most interested in, if you're interested in this subject at all. The question that some of you might want to ask is, what about yours? You haven't told us about yours. Okay, that's because there's really not that much to tell. Small, simple, short, sweet, no drama, no complications, the end. That was it. Not that much to tell. I'm going to tell you anything else? No, there's nothing else to tell. Just very simple. And I think simple is an option when it comes to weddings. It really just comes down to, what does the couple want, because they are the people who need to be making those decisions. After all, it's their lives. They're married. So let them make the decisions. If they want to pick crazy music, fine. I wouldn't, but some people might. That's what they want to do. It's their right. It's the married couple's party. The couple getting married. Let them do what they want to do, and don't subject them to a million rules. Just use basic common sense. And so there you have it, my basic view on the issue of weddings. Hope you found something interesting or amusing in there. Thanks, and have a good day.